introduce you the first speaker of the day, David Bornstein, CEO of the Solutions Journalism Network. Solutions journalism can benefit society, and actually it supports healthy democracies and public debate. But did you know that also solutions journalists can offer you more career opportunities and commissions? That's right. In this talk, David Bornstein is going to tell us how, if you cover solutions journalism, you are going to be able to find new angles that separate you from the crowd. You are going to be able to build a very strong personal brand and become an expert in a specific field. So welcome, David. The floor is yours.
Oh, thank you, Anna. It's great to be here. Well, I am excited to be here. I've been a freelancer my whole life, my whole writing career. The only job I've ever had, real job, is working for the Solutions Journalism Network. All of the other writing jobs were pitching articles, magazine articles, and eventually books. And I'm excited to talk about this topic because it's actually, I mean, it's a very personal story for me. I started off as a journalist about 30 years ago. And I had to make an early decision back in sort of the early 90s about whether I would try to get a newspaper job at the time, working as a staff writer, or just take my chances as a freelancer. And I'm really glad that I did the latter route because it's been a really thrilling career. And what I've learned sort of as a freelancer who sort of stumbled into solutions journalism about 30 years ago was that I think that there's a bunch of huge opportunities to have a really thrilling career, a rich career. And I wanted to share a little bit about my story and then sort of draw out some of the maybe the key lessons, the key things that I've learned from what happened. I mean, the lessons are sort of, I see them after the fact. I didn't think this way when I was starting out, but in retrospect, it makes sense. So back in sort of 1992, when I was trying to figure out what subjects to cover as a freelance writer, I heard about the Grumman Bank of Bangladesh, the bank that pioneered microfinance, microcredit to primarily women villagers in Bangladesh as a way to reduce poverty. For those of you who don't know about the Grumman Bank, it won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2006. But I had a decision, and I ended up, saving up some money and going to Bangladesh, and I spent a year there researching the Grumman Bank, how it worked, how its approach to poverty worked, did it work, and telling stories about or doing interviews with people across the country. And what I discovered from that process was it ended up culminating in a book, but before it became a book, it was many newspaper articles, many magazine articles that were really addressing a question like, how could the world do better or take different approaches to entrenched poverty that were very different from what the World Bank was doing. It was very different from what international aid was doing. And I came up with, I realized that what I was doing was I was kind of slicing the bread very thin. I had a story, and I'd spent years researching this story. I mean, a year in Bangladesh, but then many, other years actually looking at microfinance from different angles. And what I found was that was able to produce, it not only led to many articles coming in from different angles of the story, but after the book came out, I suddenly discovered that I started getting offers to be a speaker. And I was on the tour talking about microfinance and my book for a couple of years, and in some cases, sometimes getting good speaking fees. And in some cases, people would have me on their radio shows just as a sort of expert on microfinance. I had never thought of myself as an expert. I was just a reporter. But because I had gone so deep into the subject and really looked in a very deep way, and because I was young and I didn't have a lot of expenses, I was able to spend a year in Bangladesh, just just to do the research. I didn't have a family at the time. I didn't have a mortgage. And I think that that's one of the main things as a journalist, as a freelancer. Your competitive advantage is your flexibility, the fact that you can travel, you can go deep into subjects. Usually there's other journalists who have more access to publications, more access to certain sources, but you have a backpack. You have the ability, in many cases, to go in, to get into stories that other people really can't get into in great depth. After that book came out, I did the same thing again without realizing it. I became curious about social innovation broadly, and this field at the time that didn't really have a name. It was called social entrepreneurship, or people were talking about it. And I ended up spending another 5 years just doing research on social entrepreneurship in 10 different countries. And I found my way to finance that in different ways. I sold a lot of articles, magazine articles. I was able to really come in with fresh stories because I was looking at things that other people weren't looking at. Like, everybody is traditionally, the news is covering the problems themselves, poverty, health, refugees, what have you. And there really is, if you ask the question, what's missing? What is missing from the public's consciousness that is preventing our society or our community from solving this problem? It usually is that people don't really know what their options are. They don't know, can't answer the question, who's doing better? Or is anyone doing better? Or what's working? Or what is promising, if you don't want to claim that it's working. And once you can actually come in with stories like that, I found that if I was not overclaiming, if I wasn't coming into an editor and saying, I have the answer to this problem, but I came in with a more humble sort of like, there's a really interesting model that's emerging in this country. You've covered this issue many, many times, but you've never written about this model. To let the editor have a feeling of kind of FOMO, a fear of missing out, that there's a part of the story that they're missing. Editors hate to feel that they're missing something important. So if you create that feeling in them, you may get them to read your pitch. And what I also found from that book on social entrepreneurship over the years, because a book came out of it, was that suddenly I was an expert in social entrepreneurship, and I was getting asked to speak at conferences, and I ended up supporting myself for a couple of years, mainly on speaking fees, which was a complete surprise to me. I had never expected that. I'm an introverted person. I really had to learn how to get on stage and tell a good story in order to do that. So I had to sort of develop those skills. But going back to those key messages, asking the question, what's missing from the public conversation? What's missing from this story? Is anyone doing it better? It's always a very fruitful story in terms of just coming up with ideas. You can also just, in many cases, you can often pivot off the news. If you see that there's news emerging and everybody, when a news story emerges, everybody sort of runs to it the way they kind of run to a fire to sort of cover it. And if you stand back a little bit and can imagine what's going to be after all of this interest in this immediate story extinguishes, what are going to be the questions that people are going to be asking? You sort of give yourself, imagine what's going to be in people's mind 2 weeks from now or a month from now. You can very often pivot off the news, because usually once the flashpoint event is out of the news, and people, these stories change so quickly, then the question is, what do we do about this? It's almost always that question. Or is anyone dealing with this? And if you look at so many issues today, whether it's climate change, refugees, poverty, people living in poverty in the United States, or in many countries, racism, these stories get covered so often, and usually in the way that journalism likes to cover stories, which is, our job is to make you care. Our job is to make you experience a sense of outrage. If this is a bad thing, we want you to be really concerned. And very often that's most of what the stories are trying to do. If you think about, sort of journalism as kind of like a doctor's appointment, a good doctor's appointment helps you diagnose the illness. You have to know the causes, you have to know where it's hurting, you have to know, what the illness is. But, you also want to know what your treatment options are. And in fact, that's the most important part of the appointment for most people. They really want to understand, what can I do about this? And society is the same way. So while everybody else is running to the fire, if you can step back and start thinking, what's missing? What are people doing about this? Is anyone doing better? Is there any data and evidence about models? You can come in with something that's genuinely fresh that can advance the narrative when editors are tired of the 50th story about that issue. And if you do this over and over again, always asking that question, especially if you decide to focus on one particular issue rather than becoming an all-purpose reporter. If you say, I really want to become, one of the most knowledgeable reporters in the world about refugees or about, responses to climate, you can do that, and you can, through solutions journalism, you actually can really build up a deep knowledge or expertise in a particular issue area that's very much focused on the emerging ideas, the emerging possibilities, the experiments, how different kind of communities in different contexts are trying to deal with a set of challenges that in many cases the whole world faces. So the more you tell those kinds of stories, once you've told 5 of them or 10 of them, and you've begun to sort of look at this problem from different, it's amazing how much your sort of value to the conversation increases. Suddenly you're sort of extremely, you're sort of indispensable to an important global conversation because you've been covering some of the most important and creative or interesting emerging ideas in this space. And this is a really, I think, as when we think about the future of news and how journalism is changing, one of the biggest shifts that we're seeing today is who has power. And the traditional gatekeepers, the New York Times, the BBC, the Guardian, what have you, the traditional news sources that I'm speaking obviously in the English language, but in any language, those sources, because of the fact that people on social media can reach millions of people pretty quickly, the real power is shifting to people who truly have something important and relevant to contribute to the conversation, particularly a conversation about how we can build a more peaceful and secure and equitable world. This is solutions journalism is a really great way to align that idea. Like, as I do my journalism, I'm fortifying myself and becoming more and more valuable to these important conversations. So I'm just sort of sharing that's been my personal experience. When I got to the point where a friend and I pitched a column to the New York Times about solutions, I was able to walk in the door with my friend, and both of us, we'd had a similar, her name is Tina Rosenberg, had a similar journey where we had really carved out a kind of niche for ourselves doing solutions reporting for many years, so that when we finally sat down with the editor there to discuss the column, we had a lot of credibility. We were sort of already acknowledged as people who have covered, have introduced really important ideas to public conversations for a considerable period of time. So that's the opportunity. That's the way of kind of, what Anna was talking about, the way you can sort of create a brand or a sort of career for yourself. And at the same time, it really aligns with my motives. I went into journalism because I really wanted to tell stories that could help people see possibilities for a better world. That's just my particular, instinct. My natural instinct is to look for what's possible and try to help that grow. Other people want to go into journalism to be more investigative, to be more in a more direct accountability role. So that's really very much up to your decision. I'm going to pause in a couple of minutes to sort of have the questions, but I wanted to just get into the issue of pitching. So we have a bunch of resources on our blog and on our website that could be useful for pitching. So one of them is probably the best one, is the solutions story tracker, which I gave the links to Anna, so she'll share them around. But the story tracker has, for those of you who don't know it, it's a collection of solutions journalism from about 1,500 news outlets, or 1,400, and it's about 12,000 stories. And what you can do if you search through the story tracker is, one, you can see the kinds of stories that got published, where they got published, and who the writer is. And you can kind of get a sense of what's the market for particular kinds of stories, who are the journalists doing this, what are the publications that seem to be amenable to solutions journalism. So that's just a kind of general market analysis that helps you understand what solutions journalism looks like, and also who's doing it and where it's being published. We also have 2 other blog posts that looks at what editors are looking for and some other tips for preparing a solutions solutions pitch. So those, we'll send out those links. I don't want to go into the details since you can read them yourself. But the main themes I would say is the real advantage of a solutions journalism story, or the way that you can really hook an editor on this kind of story, is primarily through you can hear the noises in New York behind me, primarily by engaging their curiosity. So I think the most common mistake that people make is in their pitch, they sort of describe the way this thing is working and why it is working, and they sort of give away all of the key information about the story, and sometimes overclaim. You know, that's a big. So when I've been pitching these stories over the years, what I tried to do was to try to lead with something is happening that is not what you would expect, which is typically a solutions journalism story. We call it a positive deviant. There's some organization, some community is getting a result against a problem that isn't the standard result. It appears to be a better result. And you know, you've done your research, and from evidence or conversations, you feel pretty confident that this is true. The next thing you want to do is, you know, ask a question that gets the editor thinking, how is this working? You want the editor to lean in. You want them to want to call you up and say, this is interesting. Can you tell me how it works? Can you tell me what's different about this thing? Now, your pitch can suggest that there's some interesting insights in how this is going to work, and they seem to have some, they've found a way to like in the case of microfinance, they discovered a way to bank with villagers in Bangladesh that was completely counterintuitive, and they did this through a whole variety of techniques. Once you get people curious about how it's happening, that's when you really engage people, because that's really the thing that drives a great story, is curiosity. People want to know, how is this going to work? Is this going to work? What did he do next? What did she do next? And so forth in the narrative. And so setting up your pitches to really drive a sense of curiosity, and not always giving everything away in the pitch, because really the goal of a pitch is to get a phone call, to be able to talk through the story, or just to get an assignment. So you want to get someone curious enough to say, this sounds interesting. I'm curious about what's happening. Sometimes they'll ask for more information, but you don't want to sort of give away, put everything in the shop window on the first thing. At least that's been my experience. And the other main thing I would say is that traditional journalism is really, really creating extremely harmful distortions today in the world. In the United States, journalism, I can say this without overdoing it, traditional journalism has co-authored the narratives, the core narratives that have perpetuated racism in the United States, by consistently covering communities of color through a lens of what is dysfunctional for as long as we've had journalism. And so there's a real opening today in the field of journalism because of the reckoning around racism, to do better. And one of the things you need to do is you need to be able to tell whole stories, complete stories about communities that have historically been only described by what's going wrong. Now, there's many communities, not just communities of color, communities experiencing poverty, communities that are suffering in many cases from climate change, who live in areas where the only story is that they're losing their land or this and this. It's not to overcome, it's not to dismiss the problems, but to realize that there's a huge need in journalism today to move away from narratives that distort issues, that only define people in terms of their deficits and their pathologies, which is a real harmful thing to do, or only describe issues in terms of what's wrong. There's many people who go into news avoidance or motivated denial by the way we cover climate change. So all that is to say, there's a very powerful and serious critique of how journalism has created significant problems in the world today, that solutions journalism, it's not the answer to this, but it's certainly one of the important tools in addressing those core problems. And so in your pitches or in conversations with editors, and we have a lot of sources on our site, we can talk about how we need to correct the record on many, many narratives that have been put out there. And this is one way to do it. More of the same journalism, as high-minded as it may be, can often perpetuate harmful narratives and distortions. So that's a big opportunity today to help people see that this is a really important additional tool in the journalist's tool belt. So I'm going to pause there, and then and we have some time for questions. I think we have 10 minutes. Thank you.
Hi, David. Thank you so much for this presentation.
Thank you.
We have some questions in the chat.
Yeah.
We will start with Benita. Benita asks, how can political coverage take on more of the solutions journalism ethos and approach?
Yeah, that's a really hard question. Political coverage is one of the areas that is most difficult. Now, having said that, I mean, there are for example, I can speak best about the US and Canada. There are, if we're talking about problems with democracy or problems with elections or problems with the machinery of democracy, there's usually places that are doing different things. They're organizing elections differently. They're trying to figure out how to mobilize the citizenry to vote differently. So you can cover the machinery of democracy through interesting experiments. When it comes to covering candidates and the way that they are positioning themselves to run for office, I think one of the most powerful things one can do as a journalist is to find the issues that the candidates keeps talking about. And most of the time they keep talking about the problem, and then they talk about what they're going to do about it. When I'm elected, I'm going to XYZ about poverty or about climate. But usually their speeches are deeply underinformed about specifics. So as a journalist or as a news organization, you can actually go out and report a number of solution stories in the area, and then use those stories to challenge the candidates. What do you think about, the housing first model for homelessness? That is operating in 200 cities in the United States. Are you a proponent of it? Then you sort of force the candidates to do more homework, to get more. They themselves have to actually work harder and get into more specifics, and that's when you really see, are people serious? So holding people's feet to the fire and forcing them to be more accountable based on real things that are happening that they should know about is a good way for journalists to actually improve political discourse, I think.
Thank you, David. That's a great answer. Here we have Estela. Estela wonders if it's sometimes hard to evaluate whether a solution model is actually impactful.
Yes, great question. 100%. I mean, sometimes there's no data and no evidence, in which case it's a new idea that some people are excited about. That's typically why you would have heard about it. Someone mentions it to you, or the teachers are excited, or the nurses or the doctors. Someone has said, this is really interesting, or maybe the nonprofit or the for-profit or the government program that's advancing this has sent you a press release, or however you hear about it. If that's an early stage story, there may be no evidence that it's working. And in fact, you may find that, you write about it and a year later you find out that it didn't work at all. That's extremely common. So so journalism is supposed to try to capture things that are emerging. We like new things. I mean, we like to get fresh ideas and scoops and all that. So how do you cover a story when there's really no evidence of effectiveness? Well, one, you can say it's premature. I'm not going to cover it yet. I'm going to wait. I'm going to watch it for a while, which is perfectly legitimate. But then you might lose the story. Then someone else might jump on it, and then you don't have your advantage. Another one might be to say, I'm going to write the story, and I'm going to write it this is all we know about it right now. And dear reader, we're going to follow this up in a year to see if it worked. And you put a note in your calendar to come back to that story once their study comes through, or once the data is available, or whatever. Because a year later, when you write about it, if the story is it didn't work, that's a very good story. It's a really important story. We can then learn, why were all these people so excited about something that ultimately failed? it's the suppression of failure that's such a big part of why we keep making the same mistakes over and over again. Surfacing a failure is actually a really good piece of information, and it's a part of solutions journalism. It's a part of understanding what causes things to succeed. The flip side of that coin is what causes things not to succeed. I mean, they're really in some ways. And if the thing does work, or let's say the data comes out and it's so-so. In some areas it worked, but in other areas it was disappointing. It wasn't as exciting as the researchers thought it would be. That's also a very common story. Then you have a more nuanced story where you try to understand what happened. Why were not the assumptions, which assumptions were correct or which assumptions weren't correct, or so forth. But in each case, the most important thing is you can do a story that's very early stage that you can talk about as an emerging idea where there's a lot of uncertainty, the verdict is out, and since I'm bringing this to you, to our audience, we're going to commit to follow up on this when we know more, because if we just surface the story and then forget about it, it's like, what's the point of that? In some ways, we want to cover this as an ongoing conversation. And many solution stories fall into that category, by the way, especially if they're early stage.
We have here a question from Sylvie, David.
Yeah.
Sylvie asks, "Hi, David. Thank you for the presentation. Have you covered about gender equality? And if yes, were there serious difficulties or challenges?"
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the work that I did on microfinance for many years was a gender story. I mean, I was extremely naive when I went to Bangladesh. I mean, the Grumman Bank makes something like 98% of its loans to women in a Muslim society where there's a convention in the villages known as purda, where women are inhibited from sort of being able to move much as freely as men around the villages, around the countryside. So there's a very strong conservatism in that society, or patriarchy. So I would say that, for me as a white man from Canada trying to write about this story, I was completely dependent on really good translators and people to help me understand the nature of that story. So that's a very personal response to that question. But in terms of, I'm not, broadly speaking, things that are working to advance greater gender equality, there's many stories that are emerging around the world in terms of things that are attacking power imbalances, things that are creating greater voice, in terms of political processes, or in terms of places that are putting finance or the power of the dollar into different hands than they were traditionally. You can think of banking or investment stories or so forth. But I say that that's a really rich area for exploration. And we've worked with the Fuller Project as well, which does really great work focused primarily on gender, and they have brought a solutions lens to a number of their stories. It's a really great publication to check out.
We have time for one last question, David. Okay. And it's from Andreas. What is the true meaning of democracy in the time of chaotic paced journalism?
Well, I would flip the question and say, how can chaotic journalism still serve democracy instead of being sort of just a crazed running at the chaos kind of thing? I mean, I guess I'm just going to go back to my core point, which is there are these really important global conversations that are emerging. We're alive at this time in history when we have to figure out, how to, safeguard the environment, not just climate change, but species, biodiversity. We have to deal with massive inequality at the global level, and we have to deal with extreme conflict that is making the world incredibly insecure and dangerous. To the degree that journalism can speak to those challenges and produce really helpful, useful knowledge to build a better world, I think that is, it's hard to always make money in journalism. I spent 10 years without health insurance. I know what that's like. But those seem to me the things that are needed most in the world in terms of ideas, in terms of knowledge. And it feels to me like that's where journalism should really focus. That's where the deepest impact will be. And long after we're gone, hopefully it will have made a difference.
We hope so too. Thank you so much, David, for your time here today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your talk. I think it's really cool to see that solutions journalism can not only benefit the people that you report on and the readers so that they feel less helpless, but also the journalists themselves, because it's such a fresh angle somehow. And I see that we have a lot of follow-up questions in the chat. That means that a lot of people are probably quite inspired at the moment and want to try out solutions journalism for themselves or want to read up on it, which is a perfect segue into the brand new guide that we have just launched. It's created by and for freelancers, and it has tips and methods and resources on solutions journalism. And Angela is sharing you this guide in the live chat right now, so have a look.
Labdien, buenos días, vos días.
Hi, hello.
This is the European Journalism Center.
Since 1992,
we've been helping journalists all over Europe.
Now we ask for your support.
Join the European Journalism Collective.
And with a small donation, you can help us remain independent and sustainable.
So we can continue supporting journalists just like you.
And do even more.
And do even more.
And do even more.